The commonly held belief that fascism was brought to France by Hitler in 1940 is far from the truth. In reality, France has had a long history with fascism in many different forms. Long before Hitler's panzer tanks rolled down the Champs-Élysées, groups in France had been discussing and publicly declaring their wish for France to transform its government into a more authoritarian-controlled state. Beginning in the late 19th century, fascist groups had become popular in France and spread their ideas promoting a government run by the far right. These groups began gaining popularity as more French citizens became unhappy at the end of the First World War, specifically with the economic and social unrest felt after the armistice with Germany. This film focuses on the fascist groups in France in the years preceding World War II and how they missed their opportunity to take control of the French government, which could have changed history as we know forever. Many of the supporters of the fascist movement were men who had fought in World War I, and these men created the right-wing group known as the Fascism movement, which attempted to influence elected officials into passing policies which would place France under a more direct control by a central legislator. The largest fascist movements that existed in France during the interwar period, including the Fascism and PPF, were highly conservative in their basic socio-economic goals and highly anti-socialist in their basic ideological suppositions, at least if these movements are judged by the programs they put forward and not by the rhetorical double-talk they sometimes employed in seeking to expand their popular support. This group was created by Georges Veuillot in 1919, whose actual name was Alfred Georges Gresson, and was modeled after a fascist organization in Italy. The movement lost support by many of its followers immediately after the Poincaré cabinet introduced successful financial and economic policies. After the reformers proved to be successful, the far-right ideas of the Fascism movement died out, and it was essentially gone by the late 1920s. After the disappearance of the Fascism movement in the 1920s, fascist groups like the Solidarité Française and the Camarades Roy saw an increase in following, but no group used the growing immigrant population of France to convince the French people to create an authoritarian government more than the group known as the Cross of Fire. Formed in 1929, the Croix de Feu attempted to galvanize the French people together against immigrants as a way to usher in a fascist government. France entered a period of time in the early 1930s where immigration jumped to never-before-seen levels, and this increase was seen by many French as negative, allowing the feelings of xenophobia to run rampant throughout the country. The Croix de Feu used this anti-immigration sentiment to popularize their ideas of a fascist state. Another popular group was the Jeunes Patriotes, or Young Patriots, which consisted of young men who modeled themselves after Mussolini's black shirts. The group was formed in the 1920s but disappeared for a few years and then saw a large resurgence in the 1930s when it boasted over 100,000 members by 1934. The party was fueled by the anti-parliamentarism sentiment of the period and was often heard shouting their cry of "dictatorship, dictatorship." The Young Patriots felt that they represented the conservative segment of France and tried to raise awareness of the positivity that would ensue from having an authoritarian form of government, often alluding to the progress made in Germany and Italy. The leader, Pierre Taittinger, was a Champagne baron who tried to reason with the French people by offering an alternative governmental system in which a French leader was elected by the highest society of French people, which is no surprise as Taittinger was a wealthy man who was in favor of drastic economic reforms. Taittinger made the point that authoritarian rulers like Hitler and Mussolini had done fantastic things for the Germans and Italians respectively.
I reject a dictatorship of old-fashioned kind, but I am surely in favor of one that will rejuvenate our economy in France, and this is why, like the people of Italy and Germany, we will follow a leader who keeps us along a new path. We must look to always keep our economy strong, and central government will do that.
At this point, France's fascist movement had the numbers of hardcore followers and an adequate amount of funding by wealthy individuals like Taittinger to overthrow the current parliamentary form of government. Up until 1934, however, there was no large-scale governmental failure that would tip the common French citizen over the edge and create enough unrest for them to see a reason to make any large-scale political change. This would all change in 1934, however, when a Ukrainian Jew, Serge Stavisky, would anger many common French people with his embezzling. Essentially, Stavisky became close with members in parliament and used them to help him float fraudulent municipal bonds, which the Parliament then attempted to cover up. Not only did the Stavisky affair create tension between the French people and their leaders, but it also began an anti-Semitic feeling because of Stavisky's Jewish roots. For the common French person, they could now relate to the fascist party's ideas of removing their parliament and the general xenophobia that many fascists had. The entire Stavisky affair angered many of the French people, who now saw their government as corrupt, and this feeling by the general public led to a riot by the fascist groups, who marched to the Chamber of Deputies and engaged federal troops in a violent battle, which eventually ended in a loss for the fascists. In this moment, the fascists of France had a chance to once and for all use the anger the French people felt to overthrow the government and put in place a fascist regime. The many different groups that were in favor of an authoritarian state had the numbers to dissolve the government and put in a leader who would lead them into a new era. The problem that faced the fascist movement was that there was not one person who could stand above the crowd like Hitler or Mussolini and lead the people in a fascist upheaval. The inability of a central figure to emerge from the Stavisky affair was unfortunate for France's fascist movement, and the absence of a great orator would mean the loss of the ideal opportunity for the fascists to take control in France. The failure to take advantage of the Stavisky affair was twofold. Not only did the fascists miss a golden opportunity, but they had also showed their strength in a way that struck fear in France's left-wing parties, the Communists and the Socialists.
The largest political issue for France in the interwar period was that it was very politically divided, with many groups on the far left and on the far right. On the left, there was the Communists and the Socialists, and on the right were many different anti-Republican groups. These parties polarized the country, and their political differences sometimes led to turmoil for all of France.
Days after the fascist battle at the Chamber of Deputies, the Communists and Socialists marched the streets of France to support the French Republic's opposition of the fascist parties, and this collaboration would eventually spell the end for fascism in France. These groups saw the power that the fascists had, and though they were bitter enemies, the two groups joined forces in a movement known as the Popular Front, which included not only the Communists and Socialists, but any group that opposed fascism in France, such as labor unions. Since the Congress of Tours in 1920, the Communists and Socialists had been rivals, but in mid-1934, the two groups joined with one goal in mind: to stop fascism from overtaking France. The Popular Front would prove to be successful in the elections of 1936, and the movement would appoint Léon Blum as the Premier of France. The Popular Front included many labor unions which were promised better working conditions by the Popular Front, and after the election, French workers went on a massive strike that affected nearly every region of the country. Though the French would be left with tensions between the left-wing government and the workers of France, the fascists had been beaten, and aside from a small number of outlying groups, fascism in France had all but ended due to the movement's inability to take advantage of its opportunity during the upheaval brought about by the Stavisky affair.